I try to always bring things back to a real simple kind of first principle foundation and build from that. So the example I use to explain capitalism versus socialism, I say that the first man that went and dug himself a hole to protect himself from the elements was the world's first capitalist, right? He went into the world, he identified a need, which was his own protection from the elements. He applied his labor and work, possibly the use of tools, rocks, whatever, to dig this hole. And then he used this hole, this capital that he formed, to protect himself from the elements, to actually uh, satisfy a want. Right? He had a want to not get rained or snowed or sleeted on, and he did this thing to satisfy his own want. So, in that instance, this individual is sowing the seeds of work, of honesty, of delayed gratification, right? He has to work today to benefit tomorrow. And then he is reaping the fruits of his own labor. He owns the fruits of his own labor. So now we would say that he has a right in that property. He actually transformed it for his own benefit. And then the next guy that comes along and decides to bash this guy in the head with a rock and throw him in the bushes and then take over his little hole in the ground, that guy was the first socialist because he effectively is making, violently and coercively taking someone else's fruits, the fruits of someone else's labor for his own benefit. So that's the dichotomy I like to draw, is that capitalism just means that you have the exclusive rights to the fruits of your own labor, such that anything you've spent your time, energy, effort investing into to create value, you should have the exclusive right to that property and the right to trade it with others, other self-owned people that have created things of value doing the same thing, right? So, and this is all kind of rooted in natural law, that where we have the right, the natural right, not a government given right, to life, to liberty, and to property. And that's what property is, right? This relationship between man and nature. That if we've transformed it, we've added value to it, we own it, we can trade it. And then on the other end of that spectrum is socialism. That means to a greater or lesser extent, other people, namely the state, have rights in the fruits of your labor. So if you spent whatever 100 hours creating this hole in the ground, maybe they own 20% of it or 30% of it. They can redistribute it as they see fit. Um, and that's it. I would say the terminology is tricky because, especially with socialism, a lot of kind of new age young millennials or younger generations, it's a bit in vogue again. People are, fetishing Karl Marx and whatnot. And I really think, as silly as it sounds, I think this has to do with the word. Like socialism has the word social in it. Social's great. Who thinks social's known? Social, everything's good, right? I mean, I guess you could argue social media might have a little bit of a bad rap from time to time. But the idea of socializing, right? It's good. That's something healthy and communal and all these things. But socialism is this fantasy or hallucination that we can somehow collectively own capital, and the administrators of that collective ownership won't screw everyone over. I mean, they inevitably do, right? You pay taxes to the centralized body. It's meant to be redistributed perfectly, without market signals, to be this utopian fix or whatever for wealth inequality, but it never, never works out like that. Whoever gets a hold of the capital ends up giving it to their friends and family until the system collapses, right? So the best system we have for humanity is capitalism. Capitalism is a non-state statist doctrine. I almost want to say it's the difference between capitalism and all statism doctrines, because whether it's fascism, socialism, communism, these are all require big action from the state. Whether it's too far left or too far right, it doesn't really matter. It ends up in the same situation. It ends up with this giant death machine called the state. And I'm not exaggerating here. Like the state murdered 169 million people in the 20th century. That's one out of every two people in the U.S. Right, over 100 years murdered by state-funded operations. Um, so capitalism is the only economic doctrine that advocates a minimized state. There should only be enough state as the free market bears. So what we would have in that situation is no monopoly on money, and we'd probably have a world that looks much more like the sovereign individual thesis, right? Where there's a lot of government becomes a much more localized affair, where they're just really providing protection services on a consensual transaction basis at a much more localized level. And we wouldn't have this mechanism, this widespread mechanism of theft that feeds the centralized, top-heavy, federalized government. So that's, and the confusion there, I think, is probably related to, again, central banking. They very much commandeered the intellectual sphere, or have tried to do so for the past 100 some odd years. I think that's what's breaking down actually in the digital age, is you can't perpetrate these same illusions, because I forget, maybe it was Hayek said the greatest threat to the state is individual intellectual criticism or something to that effect. It's like now everyone in the world has that ability, because we can all be independent intellectual inquisitors via the web, right? Knowledge has just been totally unshackled. And as the American pragmatist described truth as the end of inquiry, now that we all have so much more time and visibility to inquire more deeply about the nature of our reality and the systems that govern us, I think we're just going to zero in on truth much more quickly. And I just don't see how an institution shrouded in lies, deception, and with more history of violence than any other institution in history, I don't see how that can persist in the digital age. Maybe I'm a hopeful optimist, but I think it's fairly practical as well to consider that the system will not